Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, and highly acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series. Today, we are super excited to welcome the prolific New York Times bestselling author, Cassandra Clare. Hi, Cassandra, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. The honor is ours. I know that everyone is excited to get started, but before we begin, I need to pause for one moment and give you all that standard housekeeping information that kind of keeps everything running smoothly, and then we will learn a lot more about our guest. Typically, we might focus on an author's most recent book, but Cassandra just has way too much amazingness to cover. So we're going to talk a little bit about everything, including her life as a writer, character development creation, as well as kind of give a sneak peek into her upcoming novel, Swordcatcher. I'd also like to note that we have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout our conversation. So when you have a direct question for Cassandra, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream. There are 3 tabs below the live stream. Click questions and you can submit your question at any time. Please keep in mind that there are a lot of you viewing the conversation tonight, so we will get to as many questions as we can. And if you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, there will be a link to the recording in your thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. Now to formally introduce our guest for the evening. Cassandra Clare was born to American parents in Tehran, Iran, and spent much of her childhood traveling the world with her family, including one trek through the Himalayas as a toddler, where she spent a month living in her father's backpack. She lived in France, England, and Switzerland before she was 10 years old. After college, Cassie lived in Los Angeles and New York, where she worked at various entertainment magazines and even some rather suspect tabloids. She started working on her YA novel, City of Bones, in 2004, inspired by the urban landscape of Manhattan, her favorite city. She turned to writing fantasy fiction full-time in 2006. Her first book, The City of Bones, became and led to numerous instant #1 New York Times and USA Today bestsellers, including but not limited to the rest of the Mortal Instruments series, the Infernal Devices series, and the Last Hours series. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have you. I hope that one of your kittens makes an appearance soon.
Yeah. You never know with the 3-month-old kittens. They suddenly appear and suddenly disappear.
So you did say kittens. How many is that plural?
We have a brother and a sister, Oscar and Izzy. They're very cute. They're very into knocking things over.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds about right for kittens. Okay, so I think it's only natural to start with kind of your journey as a writer. So before you started working on City of Bones, you said that you worked at various entertainment magazines. But is that where your writing journey actually started? Brandy would like to know what inspired you to become a writer and kind of where did it begin?
I always wanted to be a writer as long as I can remember. I think for most people who are writers, your writer's journey starts with reading. So I was a huge reader. When I was a kid, I read everything, all my parents' books. They would take me to the library. I'd get 10 books a week and read them all. And I didn't really care what genre or, what age group. I would read pretty much anything. And I think that made me a big lover of the written word and of the effect that books could have on people, and made me want to tell my own stories. So when I was 12, my father gave me a Mac Classic, which I believe is the first Apple personal computer that was ever made. And suddenly I discovered I could type all these stories, save them, go back and, edit them. And I wrote my first novel, which was called The Beautiful Cassandra, and was very bad. And so I wanted to be a writer for, all of my life. And then I think there was a period after college, where I thought, I don't know how to become a novelist. There's really not a guidebook for it. And there's not a really one single pathway to becoming a novelist. And so I thought, well, I'm going to become a journalist. I can see how that works. I can see how you apply for those jobs, get those jobs, work as a journalist. And so I did that and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the same for me as writing fiction. So I got back into writing fiction after I had worked as a journalist for maybe 5 or 6 years. And then I wrote City of Bones.
Okay. So was your first novel, The Beautiful Cassandra, was that fantasy fiction?
Not really. It was a romance novel. I mean, I think it was fantasy in the sense that improbable things constantly happened, but it was about a young girl in the 17th century. I didn't really know anything about the 17th century who falls in love with a young man, but they're cruelly separated. And so she goes to find him and she has a lot of adventures on the way. She's kidnapped by pirates and she joins a group of bandits and becomes their bandit queen. I mean, it's not a good book, but it is hilarious. I look back on it now and I enjoy how much I was clearly having fun, even though it was bad.
I mean, it was clearly fantastical.
Yeah, it's true. There were bandits and there were pirates. There just weren't like dragons and wizards or anything like that. But it clearly was not a series of things that would ever actually happen.
So what ultimately then drew you to that genre, writing fantasy fiction?
My father's a huge science fiction fantasy fan. So I read all of his books. And I think it was the Lord of the Rings that first got me into fantasy, because before that I had been a reader of more of my mother's books. So we had read together and we read all the Austen books and all the Bronte books. My mom's a big Anglophile and lover of classic literature. But then, to her dismay, I found my dad's fantasy book collection. I tore through them, all the science fiction, all the fantasy. And I realized, that this was the stuff that I really loved. So after that, I would go every week with my dad to this great independent bookstore in Los Angeles called A Change of Hobbit. Doesn't exist anymore, I'm sad to say, but it was all science fiction and fantasy. And I would pick one book a week and read it. And so I just, became a fantasy fan.
Mm-hmm. So Nadia is asking, what steps did you have to take to finish and publish your first book? And that kind of goes along with, we get a lot of questions about kind of how did you find a publisher and what was that process? Was it grueling? Did it take a long time?
It took a long time to finish the book. It took me about 3-4 years because I had never written a whole novel before. And so I was teaching myself to write a novel while I was writing the novel. So that took a long time. Then a friend of mine was doing, I had, at this point existed on sort of the periphery of the New York writers scene. I would go to readings and I would meet other writers. And at a reading, my friend Holly Black introduced me to her agent, Barry Goldblatt. Okay. And so I told him about my book and he asked to look at it. I sent it to him. He liked it. That was City of Bones. And then he sent that out and it took maybe 8 months for it to sell to a publisher. So it's not a wildly exciting story, but I think, what I remember as the really difficult and hard part was finishing a first novel in the first place, Yeah.
I think a lot of people like to hear those stories because it gives inspiration for probably the many years that they've been working on their own book. And they're like, there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
I know a lot of agents. They're always, and I think it feels very forbidding, initially like to send your book out, but they're always really looking for new writers and new exciting things. So, I always try to tell people, not to be don't be scared of sending your book to an agent. They're actively looking for someone like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even just looking at a literary agent website, you constantly see taking submissions welcome. Here are the kinds of things that I like. Yeah, that's great. So Emily wants to know what surprised you most about the publishing process, and how or what would you have changed regarding this process?
Well, I think what surprised me initially was how long it took. I sold my book and then it took 2 years for it to actually come out. And it felt like forever. But that's actually pretty normal. Oh. So I think the first surprise was it takes so long. And I mean, there's a lot of learning with publishing and just sort of the way that it works and how the industry functions. I'm trying to think if there's something I would have changed, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know. I mean, like, it's not that I think I've always made perfect decisions. It's more like, I feel like obsessing over things like what would I have done differently is not the best way to go forward. You always want to sort of go forward, positively and feel like you have learned from all of the things that, have happened in your career.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It's a very optimistic way to look at it too. So, do you think then, since you started writing City of Bones and where you are currently, Abby wants to know how you think you've evolved as a writer?
I mean, I hope I've gotten better. Go back and I look at City of Bones, and it's really different from the rest of my books, which I find interesting. If I reread them, it has a very different flavor and voice. And I think that it's because I was teaching myself to write a book. And after that, I was more like, okay, I know I can write a book. Now I want to, grow and experiment with the kinds of books that I write, always be kind of setting myself new challenges, changing things up. So I feel like I've become a better researcher. I feel like I've become better at writing the voices of characters who are not like me. I feel like, I've learned things about, as we all do, I think about pacing books and about creating mysteries, utilizing, your old friends foreshadowing and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I've gotten better, but I'm still learning.
Well, I think that writing is your supernatural power. Like, I feel like
you definitely not drawing.
Oh yeah, well, we've got questions about that too. Your amazing covers, your amazing book covers. So those aren't you. You don't have-
Those are my wonderful artist designer Cliff Nielsen, who is a great artist. I draw a person, they come out looking like a parking meter.
You're like, here's my outline, make it pretty.
I have done that when I'm talking to Cliff, because we will often work together on the concept for a cover, and I'm like, here's my drawing. Like, it is hopefully at least it communicates where I think people should be standing.
I like it. So you talked about your research process being more effective or organized. We get so many questions for every author about research and writing processes, especially when the books span eras. Oh, yay!
Kitten.
Oh. All right, we'll talk about the kitten now.
No, it's Izzy. She's just stopping by. You don't need to talk about her. You're a good cat. I'll put you down. All
right. And so Heather wants to know how in the world you keep all of the intricate details to your stories and to your worlds. How do you keep it all organized?
For a long time, I kept it in my head, and then I started to realize that was too much. I couldn't actually keep it all straight with no notes and nothing like that. So my assistant and I created a thing we call the Bible, which is like a big sort of bound folder that has different sections for history, weapons, characters, magic system, the magic system, everything that, family trees, everything that could be in the books, the descriptions of basically all objects. And so I go back and use that a lot, as a reference tool when I'm working on the Shadowhunter books. I'm always like, if my house burned down, that would probably be the first thing that I saved.
So have you ever had an inkling to publish a Shadowhunter's Bible that has all of that in it?
I don't know. I mean, a lot of it's spoilery. And I'm like, well, as long as I'm writing the books, I think I keep it to myself. But if I'm ever like fully done with the Shadowhunters universe, then I would think about publishing it.
I could imagine that people would love to have that. So we have a lot of questions on character development. So let's transition a little bit there. You received a lot of accolades in pre-submitted questions for your characters always being so real and relatable. And a lot of people, including Abigail, said, can you talk to us about your process for developing characters? These characters that your readers really connect to so well.
Yeah, I can talk about process. And thank you. That's a very nice thing to say. I feel like, especially with writing fantasy, one of the things that grounds fantasy, makes it believable, is psychological realism of the characters. I want to create a situation where what happens feels fantastical, but the way that people respond to it feels real, and their motivations and characterization feels real. So with each character, I kind of go into thinking about them as sort of a whole person, and how would they respond to a certain situation. So I, think of what's their whole backstory, what's made them who they are, what kind of, person are they, how do they respond in this situation, what are the things. I think, the biggest question you ask yourself about a character is, what does my character want more than anything else? And then you want to ask yourself, what does my character fear more than anything else? What has hurt my character more than anything else that's ever happened to them? What is the disconnect between what my character thinks they need and what they actually need? So those, I usually create worksheets for myself to ask those questions about characters and fill them in, and kind of roll those questions around in my mind until that character feels like a fully developed human being.
And Caitlin wants to know, how do you create such incredible kind of found family / friendship dynamics? Are they based on friendships that you have or you desire, that you've seen in others?
I was an only child. Growing up, we moved around a lot. So I think I always had that strong desire for a found family of people who would, be your strongest connections and support in the world. And so I think just that being something that I always wanted. And I do feel like I found it. I have a very strong, really wonderful friends group that I rely on. And I do base, aspects of friendships and relationships that I create between characters on my own personal experiences. But also just, I think you also reach into what are the kind of friendships that you've always wanted. What seems to you to be the most significant thing about, a friendship, and what would you like a friendship to be? And if you had a found family, what is the dynamic of that family? I've written about people who have come together as a sort of family, in Mortal Instruments, people who are actually related in Dark Artifices, a mix of those two things in Last Hours. So I'm always interested in exploring those dynamics on multiple different levels.
Kind of on that same path, Catherine says your characters often make mistakes or have regret, which adds another layer of relatability. How do you identify flaws in a character and opportunities for that character's growth?
I think you have to not be afraid to let the character make mistakes and let them do things that are even, morally wrong, because everybody does make those kind of mistakes. And I think that writers often worry, what if people won't like this character because, they've made mistakes, they've done bad things. I think of Matthew in The Last Hours, who, when I first created him, I knew there was something that was making him unhappy. And because his whole character was sort of reactive to that unhappiness. And it took me a while to figure out what it was. And when I did figure out what it was, I thought, this is really, really bad. Are people going to be able to get past the fact that he did this? And I was like, well, it really, I think, is key to his character that he did this. And also, one of the things about his character is how much he regrets it and would like to fix it. And yeah, Nick Matthew has been one of the most, I think, popular characters from the series. I think people really do relate, even if we don't make mistakes on the epic scale that sometimes people in books make mistakes. We all do things that we have regretted. We all have moments where we feel like we weren't our best. And I think that is something that's really relatable in a character. So I think that's something that I'm always interested in exploring.
Great. Jamie is asking, how do you decide what point of view to write from?
Usually in terms of a scene, because most of my books have multiple points of view, I think, who is the character in the scene who has the most at stake?
Okay.
Who's the most invested in the outcome of this scene? And then I'll write from that character's point of view.
I'm still just amazed at how you keep it all straight.
Well, sometimes it's also, sometimes it's the circumstance, there's only one character who could possibly be in this scene or could observe this thing. Mm-hmm. But if that's not the case, and if it's like a group scene, then I'll think, okay, who's the most invested in the outcome of this?
Has there ever been a character that revealed themselves to be a lot different than you initially expected and started writing them as?
I'm thinking. I mean, there've definitely been characters that I didn't realize were going to be as big in the book as they turned out to be. And I think probably Magnus is the first one of those. Like, I knew in City of Bones that he was going to be Alec's boyfriend, but I didn't realize what a big character he was going to be and how significant he was going to be in everybody's life. And realize he was going to have his own spin-off novels, you know, like how much Magnus grew to be the sort of moral center of the Mortal Instruments universe was very surprising to me.
Mm-hmm. We do get a lot of questions in the pre-submitted questions about kind of when you know whether or not there's going to be another book. So, for example, did you know when writing City of Bones that it was going to be a series? And did you know that it was going to continue kind of into this Shadowhunter universe? Like, when did you know all of that? Has it just been like step by step, or is this what you envisioned?
It's pretty step by step, but I think partially because of just the way publishing works. You know, you sell a series if you're writing a series, or you sell a certain number of books, and you have to hope like that people find those books and that they like those books and there's enough demand for those books that you'll be able to write more. So I initially planned 3 books in the Mortal Instruments, and then I was able to expand it into 6 books, which I was excited about. And very early on, I knew I wanted to do the Infernal Devices, but I had to write, you know, I think the first 3 Mortal Instruments books before I feel like I had the confidence to feel like I could write a historical series in this universe. It was something I always wanted to do, but wasn't sure that I could do. And then after that, I did plan out more. Like, I sort of mapped out like, okay, what's the full like extent of this universe? You know, I knew I wanted to do then Dark Artifices and Wicked Powers, which follows on after the Dark Artifices. And doing the last hours was sort of actually a response to how excited people were about the idea of the kids of the characters from the Infernal Devices. And so I had made a family tree, which is very inaccurate, but it had like a lot of the names of the kids on it. And so I began to think about, what are those kids like? You know, what kind of personalities do they have? How do they get along with each other? You know, what's it like being the children of these characters that were written about in previous books? And so that became a story that I wanted to tell.
Very cool. Cynthia wants to know, what's the most difficult thing about writing a male character's point of view, and how have you overcome this potential challenge?
I mean, there's mostly I don't find it difficult. Every once in a while I'll get a detail wrong. It's kind of funny. I read my books out loud to my husband when I'm done with them, mostly to catch things like word repetitions or continuity errors, but sometimes he'll correct me. And I feel like the thing I've had most trouble with male characters is just tiny little details. Like, I remember once I had a character pull his shirt over his head by the hem, and my husband was like, no, if you're a boy, you take your shirt off by reaching behind you and pulling the shirt over your head. And I was like, man, I've never noticed that.
Yeah, no, I'm going to stare at my husband. And
I know, right? I was like, I never even gave that any thought. So it's very, very small, detail-y things. But otherwise, I feel like, you know, it's right, you know, you're digging into the essence of the character, like who they are as a person, and that doesn't have that much to do with their gender.
Let's see. Sabrina wants to know, how often do you practice your writing in a non-book related context? So do you do writing outside of the books that you get published?
Not.
I can imagine that you
I don't have a lot of spare time for extra writing. I did take some time off this year, and I sort of fiddled around with sort of the beginnings of a new story with some short stories that I had started but not finished. So that was kind of fun, but it was the first time I'd been able to do that in a long time. I think also one of the things that's about transitioning into being a professional writer is that writing goes from being your hobby to being your job. And when something is your job, you don't necessarily want to do it as a hobby. Like, I'm pretty sure that professional chefs don't necessarily want to cook all the time. So, and you want to preserve that like enthusiasm for the writing and excitement about doing it. And so I tend not to do like a lot of writing outside of the enormous amount of writing that I actually do have to do professionally.
Is it kind of So when you write with other authors, when you co-author, do you prefer that to working alone, or do you prefer to have kind of autonomy over everything?
They're both fun, but in different ways. I like working with other authors. I liked working with my friend Holly on the Magisterium series. I worked with Wesley Chu on the Eldest Curses. I've written short stories with people. So I do like co-writing. I've done a lot of it. And it's fun to have somebody to bounce ideas off. But there is something about being the only person who's involved in the book, and you have complete, both complete control and complete responsibility for everything that happens. That is a different, like, very fulfilling kind of process.
Mhm. Chloe would like to know, how did you create such an in-depth and fleshed out magic system?
I mean, I'm trying to think. This is so long ago that I created the Shadowhunters. It was 2005, and it took about 3-4 years to write that first book. So we're talking about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And certainly the magic system has grown.
I was going to say, you add to the magic system from time to time. So
you definitely add to a magic system. So I think the thing, at least for me, is if you're hoping to do a long-running series, or you want to create a magic system that's flexible, that you can add to, that isn't too like rigid and limited. So one of the things that I did when I created the Shadowhunter magic system was to try to create something that felt like, it could support a lot of different stories. And one of the ways I did that was I created the magic system, and then I gave the system to my best friend's husband, who is a D&D gamer. And I said, run some adventures in this world, like create a bunch of characters and you and your friends play, and, run a bunch of adventures in this world and tell me how it works. Because, once you've got characters and they're running around in the world and they're testing the limits of the magic system, you learn a lot about how the magic, that magic system works, and if there's any shortfalls or places where it doesn't function. And that was really helpful for me.
Great. We've had a lot of questions about the titles of your books.
Okay.
Can you, I guess, just talk generally about how you decide on a title of your book? Is it your decision, or does the publisher step in there?
It's my decision. Generally, I've always named my own books, and I've never had much pushback, except so initially Clockwork Angel and Clockwork Prince and Clockwork Princess were called The Clockwork Angel and The Clockwork Prince and The Clockwork Princess. And my publisher was like, get rid of the. That's about the only thing I can think of to a title. But no, A City of Bones came from, I was in the catacombs in Paris, which is an underground like city that's made out of bones. I get very literal. And there are benches made of bones and wall decorations made of bones and chandeliers made out of bones. And I thought this would, be an amazing setting. And that gave me the idea for the City of Bones in the books. And then, City of, led to the other names of the other books. The Infernal Devices. I mean, man, I'm trying to remember like what I had the idea for Tessa's Clockwork Angel necklace very early on in the story, and how it functioned and sort of what it did. So it seemed like such a significant piece of business that it became the title. The Last Hours is from a Dickens quote. They do come from all over. And for me, it's really about finding a phrase or, short phrase or something like that feels evocative and feels like it evokes something about the book.
That's very good to know. I feel like when you're reading a book, there's like a moment where you're like, oh, that's where the title came from. So it's always interesting to hear if the title, because I've had authors say that the title came to them first, like with the thread of an idea. And then I've had authors say, oh no, my publisher had to help me name it because the name I chose was awful. So it's kind of
have that happen. I'm picky about names.
Well, let's ask one last character question from Leah. Leah says, your characters have left a huge impact on me, and the world you've created is one that I would love to live in if I could. What advice do you have for those wanting to write and also create characters that leave so much impact on readers?
I mean, I think I would say don't be afraid to let your characters have flaws and make poor decisions sometimes. Who your character is determines the plot. The plot doesn't determine the character. So, the best thing to do is to get to know your character really well. maybe write a couple like experimental little stories in which you put them in different situations, see how they react, think about questions. Like you can find all sorts of character worksheets online that are helpful. Eventually you will develop one of your own, like as I have, that answers the questions that are most important to you. But if you're just starting out, I feel like you go online, like Google character worksheet, you'll find a few and they'll ask you lots of questions about your characters. And in the act of answering them, you will learn more about that character. And I think that, you know, what you want to always be thinking about is, does this character feel like a real person? You know, this is a real person that I might know, that I could become friends with, that, you know, would actually exist.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is what you're a master at, is like creating these characters that people believe and that they do want to be friends with, or that they see themselves in. It's amazing.
I hope so.
So we do have a couple of plot questions. Brianna says, crafting an expansive literary universe poses a considerable challenge for writers. Your dedication to cultivating this world across a span of over 10 years raises the question, how do you approach the task of envisioning and consistently enriching it? Is the entirety of the world meticulously planned before embarking on the journey of writing from the initial volume, or are you always planning new things?
I think both. There's a lot of the world that is planned out ahead of time and that I already know. And then there's a lot of things that get invented as I'm going. Things like the Scholomance, which was invented, I think, in Dark Artifices to sort of address the idea of Shadowhunter College and like Shadowhunter education outside of just the Shadowhunter Academy, which is high school. And I was like, okay, but there's, you know, we know that there are Shadowhunters who study and, you know, go on to, you know, study runes, magic, history, whatnot. Where do they do that? So I think you're always sort of adding on to the world as you find things that, you know, fill a gap. And also things change in the world. So, you know, a lot of things have changed in the Shadowhunter world as the books have progressed. And so new things have to be created to address those changes. I think, you know, the world is a living thing, just like history. Yeah. And so you have to think about it, you know, as that.
Thank you. So I do want to talk about your new book, if that's okay.
Sure.
Swordcatcher. So for those of you who don't know, there's Cassandra has a new book coming out in October called Swordcatcher. Can you give a brief summary of Swordcatcher?
Sure. This is a high fantasy. So unlike Shadowhunters, which is contemporary fantasy, meaning like it exists in our world, exists in a completely invented world, like Game of Thrones. Or Lord of the Rings. And so this is an invented world in which there is a city-state called Castellane. Castellane is a extremely wealthy, extremely corrupt, extremely active, extremely like high highs, low lows, very rich, very poor, city of contrasts. And so it begins with the swordcatcher himself, who is a boy named Kellyan, who is taken to the palace in Castellane to become the body double for the Prince of Castellane. And they're only about 8 years old in this beginning part. And so he has to learn to sort of look like the prince, talk like the prince, walk like the prince, act like him, because his job is to stand in for him in public so that any assassination attempts will kill him and not Prince Connor. And he loves the prince like a brother. They're very close, but at the same time, he has this conflict in which his job is to die for Connor, and that is a very complicated transaction of power. The other protagonist is a girl named Lancaster. She lives in a walled-off part of the city called the Salt, which contains the Ashkar people, who are the only people left in this world who can still do magic. She's a doctor, and she practices healing magic, and she is called to the palace to help after an assassination attempt is made on the prince's life. And so she gets pulled into this sort of mystery about the assassination, about court politics, about who's, you know, responsible. And I think that's all I can say.
I think that teaser is like throwing everybody onto the internet to pre-order the book now. So this is not a YA novel, though. This this is adult fantasy novel. Okay. Kayla wants to know what inspired you to write an adult fantasy novel after writing YA for so long.
I wasn't really thinking about, like, is this going to be adult or is this going to be YA? I got the idea for the book and started to sketch it out. And as I did, I realized the characters in it were in their 20s. And it's just sort of how they came into my head. It's funny because when I first started writing YA, it's the same thing. The characters came into my head and they were teenagers. And so people always used to say, why YA? And I was like, that's just how old the characters were. That's the stage of life that they're in. And with Swordcatcher, they're just in a later stage of life. You know, I wanted Lynn to be a doctor. That's something that takes many years of study. You know, Connor is the prince who is about to become the king. You know, Cal has been doing his job for more than 15 years. So all of that like combines to make them of an age in which, you know, you wouldn't write a YA book about them because their concerns and their, you know, interests and whatnot don't line up with that era of life experience. They have the concerns and the interests and whatnot of older people. And as far as, you know, I'm concerned, that is the only thing that makes YA an adult different is, you know, what age are your characters and what are their interests and their concerns about. If they are match up with teenager, you know, with young adult era expectations and interests, then it's YA. If they're adults, then it's adult.
So since it was kind of based on like where you saw the characters at, then did you find anything challenging about writing from an adult perspective? I couldn't imagine because you're an adult. But Cynthia wants to know what most excited you about this transition and what have you found challenging about it?
I mean, I think both the thing that's fun and the thing that's challenging is that it's different. And, you know, writing about people who are at this very different life stage than the people who are in Shadowhunters was, you know, different. Like the way that they relate to their families is different. The way they relate to their parents is different. The way they relate to the idea of marriage or children is different. You know, they have a whole different set of sort of interests and priorities. And I think one of the things about writing YA that I really enjoy is it's often stories of firsts, first love, first loss, first grief, you know, and so you're dealing with firsts. And when you're dealing with adults, and this I found challenging but interesting, you're not dealing with the first time. They fall in love, probably been in love before. If they lose someone, they probably lost someone before. So it's interesting to approach it from a different angle.
Might make their backstories more complicated and
they do have more complicated backstories because they've just had longer to create very complicated backstories.
On top of creating a fictional world. I mean, I know that Shadowhunters, of course, is its own kind of universe, but they were based in a real place. And this is just a completely fictionalized world. Was there anything specific that you based your world off of, like that you took inspiration from?
Jewish mythology. I'm Jewish, and usually when I experience magic and magic systems in books, they often feel very influenced by cultures that aren't mine, and I don't see a lot of sort of Jewish-based magic. So the magic in these books and also sort of the history and the things that inform the book are very much based in Jewish culture. So yeah, that's a significant part of the world building.
Very cool. I'm glad that I asked that question. Okay, so Imani would like to know, do you know yet if your new Swordcatcher, it might become a series or a multi-layered universe, or do you think that it'll remain solo?
Well, Swordcatcher's already 2 books. So the first book is called Swordcatcher. The second book is called The Ragpicker King, and who is a character in the first book. And I would like it to be more books. Yeah, I'm hoping to do 4 books. But we're going to see how it goes with the first 2 books and go from there. It's always interesting starting a new world because you have no idea how people are going to respond to it. So I feel like, you know, if people enjoy it and they like it, then I'll, you know, keep writing in that world.
Good. Thank you. Connor wants to know, is there a period of time period or a location that you've always wanted to write about that you just haven't yet?
Always kind of wanted to do Shadowhunters in the Roaring 20s, you know, Prohibition, all of that. I think it would be really fun. I just have no idea. I don't have an actual story. It's just a really fun setting.
Yeah, I think that I can already kind of picture these lavish
flapper Shadowhunters. I really would be fun, but I'm like, I don't know what they're doing.
Cynthia wants to know if you hide any Easter eggs in your books that only a few readers might find, and if so, how do we look for them?
I don't know. I should probably put out a guide, right, for Easter eggs or something like that. There's definitely little things in the books that if you have read the other books, they connect up to each other. The Last Hours and the Dark Artifices definitely reference each other. There's parts in the Dark Artifices where our main characters are in London at the Institute, which is where the characters in The Last Hours lived. And they find things like they find a photograph of, I think, the Merry Thieves, the boys from Last Hours. They find a quote that's Cordelia's favorite quote. Somebody has, I think, scratched like a Lucie Herondale plus Jessie Blackthorne into one of the windows. So they don't know what any of this means. It doesn't mean anything to them, but if you read The Last Hours, it means something to you. So there's a lot of little back and forth details like that. Or for instance, Jace at some point in the Mortal Instruments is imprisoned in the Silent City, and he finds a message scrawled on the wall that was put there by Jessamine, who is imprisoned in the Silent City during the Infernal Devices. So if you know your Infernal Devices, then you know who wrote the message. But if you don't, then it's just a weird message he finds.
Well, now I'm going to have to reread everything. So have you, we had some questions about fans and like their art, and you and I were talking about this right before we went live too. Do you have any favorite like fan art or fan fiction that you've found over the years?
I haven't read any fan fiction, but I did once ask my husband to go and look on Archive of Our Own and tell me what the most popular fan fiction for Shadowhunters was. And it was one where Magnus is the High Warlock of Seoul and Korea. And he, I think, is in a relationship with the guys from BTS. And I was like, that seems awesome. I'm sad I can't read it. But I don't read fanfic. Just, I don't want to get ideas from it or anything like that, or be influenced. So I'm happy for people to do it. I just don't read it. Fan art I love and, can get involved with. I don't have a favorite, piece of fan art or a favorite fan artist, but I've worked with a lot of great fan artists over the years. I think some of the ones people would be most familiar with would be Cassandra Jean, who has designed a tarot deck for me, done like 2 books of illustrations. She's illustrated the sort of the 10-year anniversary edition of City of Bones. Then there's Charlie Bowater has done, I think, 2 calendars for me, and she does really beautiful art. So there's a lot of different artists that I've worked with. Usually I have one piece of fan art for every newsletter that I send out every month. So that's always a way to see the fan artist, to sign up for the newsletter, and then you'll get a piece of fan art either from an existing book or an upcoming book.
I can't imagine the excitement that those fans have to feel when they get an email or a comment or something on their art, and it's like, hi, it's me. Can I
hope so. It's interesting because, you forge relationships with people through the work. And so like Cassandra Jean, I didn't know her. I reached out to her. I said, I like your work. And now we've been working together 15 years, she's no longer particularly impressed by me, but we are good friends, which is better.
So you mentioned the fan fiction about Magnus, and you're right. Like you said earlier, a lot of people really love Magnus, and Katerina is saying in the Infernal Devices, and in all of your books, but Katerina says in the Infernal Devices, your representation of trans and polyqueer characters was still quite new to mass media. What motivates you to write with such incredible representation?
I think that for me, when I was growing up, one of my best friends several of my best friends were members of the queer community, and they really didn't see themselves represented in the kind of books that they liked to read. Meaning, like, if you wanted to find a representation of a gay or lesbian teenager, you were going to find it in a novel that was about how hard it was to be a gay or lesbian teenager, but there would not be any fantastical elements. And, just because I mean, I'm trying, like, just because I'm Jewish doesn't mean I only want to read books about Jews being Jewish. I want to read books about us kicking ass and doing awesome things and having adventures. And I feel like that's true for everybody. And so I always wanted the Shadowhunter world to feel like a world that anybody and everybody was welcome in. So I wanted it to showcase, diversity across the board. So diversity in race, but also diversity in neurotypicality. So we have Ty, who is autistic, and we have other characters who are neurodivergent. We have Diana, who is trans. We have many, gay, bisexual, lesbian, queer characters across the board. And that mostly is just about feeling like I want everyone who reads the books to feel like they could be in the books, that they could be a Shadowhunter, and there's no barrier for entry, or there's only one kind of person who can be a Shadowhunter.
That makes complete sense. And I feel like your books are one of the first books that I read with that kind of representation.
I think it's, I think there's a much more of a wide variety of representation in YA fiction now. And that's wonderful. And it's so good to see. But that's definitely true that when I started, that wasn't necessarily the case.
So Janice is asking about the Magisterium series. Janice says, I loved the Magisterium series. Do you see yourself delving back into the middle grade realm?
I really loved writing Magisterium. I really loved writing with Holly Black, and she had worked previously on Spiderwick. And so she really knew her way around middle grade. I don't know if I would want to launch out into another middle grade project without her. I sort of associate Holly with writing for that age group. So if I can get her to be less busy than she is, then maybe she will co-write another series with me. I would really enjoy that. Hi, Holly.
So in response to you talking about being representative, creating characters that represent everyone, Jay has asked a question. What is your stance on censorship, if you have one? Do you have any firsthand experience with censorship of your work? And how did you or would you handle the situation?
I mean, my stance is anti. I think that you won't find many writers who are pro. I think that, it's really disturbing to me the way that books are being used to wage a culture war in the US right now. And we're seeing books in schools being banned for ridiculous reasons mostly by people who don't even have children in the schools. And I hate that. I think we all do. Books, I don't feel books hurt people. I feel that they help people, and that the kind of books that are under attack, which is very specifically books about people of color and books about the LGBT community, are exactly the kind of books that kids need. And so I feel like it's doing, them great harm. I feel like it's extremely harmful for teachers. It's harmful and dangerous for librarians. It's harmful and dangerous for literacy. So yes, I feel very strongly anti. Absolutely, my books have been banned all over the place. I mean, if you go to Pan America, they actually keep a really good sort of roster of all books that have been banned or challenged in various places. So you can see, if your own book has been banned and challenged. Mine absolutely have, mostly because Magnus and Alec are in them. There's not really another reason. Sometimes they're challenged because of Diana, or because of Helen and Aline, or some other characters that are queer, but that's really the only reason that they ever get challenged. And it's always, frustrating. I feel like, all we can do is sort of, do our best to speak up about censorship and to talk about why, there's this sort of covering lie that this is protecting people. But it's actually not protecting people. It's actually doing them a lot of harm.
Yeah, I completely agree. Especially as a librarian who's no longer working in a physical library, I couldn't agree more. I can't imagine what librarians in, like, public librarians are going through right now in this kind of fight.
I know. And, these are people who are doing a job because they love books and they love putting books into the hands of people that are going to enjoy them. And, they're being punished for it. And that's really despicable.
It is. I agree. Okay, so we did get a handful of questions about your work being realized in film or on TV. And I know that Mortal Instruments did at one point have a TV show. But Alan wants to know, I'm sure this is a question on everybody's mind. What's the fate of, or is there any glimmer of hope that the rest of the Mortal Instruments series might either come back to TV or someday be realized in film?
You never know, right?
Or any of your series.
I mean, it's tough because Mortal Instruments was a movie and it was a TV show. So I feel so Hollywood feels they've done that. You know, they gave it its shot.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could convince somebody to go back and do it again, even though I think a lot of us don't feel like the story really got told. You know, a version of it got told, but not the version that's in the books. We've never seen that.
Right.
In terms of Infernal Devices, you know, I'm always hopeful that somebody will want to do it because I feel like it would be such a fun TV show and the setting is so, you know, beautiful and luxurious and romantic, and, you know, the right person who was invested in doing that, you know, show couldn't do a really good job. So I would be excited to see that. I think that would be the most likely of the Shadowhunters books to get an adaptation, because Dark Artifice, you kind of have to know Mortal Instruments. Last Hours, you kind of have to know Infernal Devices. So I feel like we're probably looking at, you know, Infernal Devices, which is great if it could get made. Right now, as there was a huge writer strike going on in Hollywood,
yeah,
is getting made. So we're nowhere with that. But you know, with Swordcatcher, it's interesting because I've seen what it's like to have something that hasn't been adapted before and how excited people are about it. And so, you know, that I think is more of a possibility than Shadowhunters. Though if they made Swordcatcher into something and it was successful, I'm sure they would go back and take another look at Shadowhunters and maybe think about, you know, rebooting it.
Just picturing Swordcatcher on HBO.
It would be a very expensive show.
Okay, so Katie is saying, what is your best advice for someone who is interested in becoming an author? Katie specified 13 to 18, but I feel like the advice could probably apply to everyone. Or what do you wish you had known as you started writing in your career?
I think that I wish that, I mean, the stuff that I wish I had known is all very practical stuff, about querying agents, about talking to editors, about taking editorial advice, about knowing what your rights are as a writer. So I think, you know, my best advice first is finish what you're working on. A lot of times people get halfway through a book or, you know, a project and give up. It is hard. It's really hard. It's not hard to start something, but it's hard to keep going. So if you can finish, you're already ahead of most people. And then in terms of querying agents, if traditional publishing is what you want to do, and it's the only thing I know about, so it's the only thing I can give advice about, I don't know anything about indie publishing, then I would suggest that you look in the back of books that you think are either books you really love or books that you feel are similar to yours, because every writer thanks their agent in the acknowledgments. So then if you're like, my books are a lot like Megan Whalen Turner's books, then you look at the back of the book and you find out who her agent is and you query that person. And, you know, because they're likely to have, you like those books, that means they like those books too. You're likely to have similar taste. So I feel like that's good. And then when you do become a writer, you'll get a contract from your publisher. I would say, you know, one of the things I didn't think about at the time was what's in the contract. How can I best protect myself? So be really careful about your contract. Read the whole thing. Make sure that it's fair to you and they're not grabbing any rights that should actually belong to you.
Like, I'm so excited. I'll sign anywhere.
That is how you feel. And I'm like, don't do that.
Very good advice. And be patient, right? It could take 2 years for your book to come out still.
Absolutely. I don't think that's gotten any faster.
Oh, gosh. So Ayana wants to know, if you had not become an author, what would your dream job be? I know that you said that you became a journalist because you didn't know how to write a novel, and that seemed very cut and dry. But would that have been your dream job?
I think my dream job would have been travel writer. I love travel. It's the thing I love the most, second to writing. And so I love going to new places and visiting, experiencing different cultures, going all over the world. There's a lot of stuff in my books. If you've read, all the Shadowhunter books, people are always traveling all over the place, because I really, love, the creating different settings for the books and putting the characters into new places. So I'd like to think I would have become a travel writer. I could have written, for magazines or whatever. I don't think I have like an idea of what I would do if it didn't involve any kind of writing.
Yeah.
Maybe I could work with cats. Does anybody work with cats? Can you train cats?
Yeah. Well, I had this. I tried to start an Instagram page about cats. It didn't really work, but
it seems like fun though.
Hmm?
It seems like fun though.
Oh yeah, no, I literally just took pictures of cats in bars.
Ordering drinks.
There are a lot of cats in bars in New Orleans.
That is amazing. I'll look out for that.
It's called Nola Bar Cats. Anyway, so one of the questions that I like to close on, and everybody always asks me to repeat it, or they go through at the recording because they want to know the author that I'm speaking to, is your favorite author. What should they run to the library and check out? What are you reading right now? Those are kind of 3 different questions, but
they are. Okay, so my favorite author probably of all time is Dorothy Dunnett. She wrote a series of historical fiction books called The Lyman Chronicles, and she has real knack for creating characters that are extremely multidimensional and feel extremely human and relatable, and are always surprising you. So I love those. Then what should you run to the library and check out? If you've never, I mentioned Megan Whalen Turner earlier randomly, but if you've never read her Queen's Thief series, you should run to the library and check out the first book, which is called The Thief, but again, has an amazing twist that you'll really love. And then what I'm reading right now is a book called Hidden Pictures. And I have to actually look up, Jason Rekulik wrote it. And it is about a young woman who becomes the nanny for a small boy who begins to draw a series of ever more disturbing pictures. And the pictures are included in the book, which I really love because like I've said, I can't draw at all, but I love art and I always admire people who can draw. And so the evolution of the pictures as they become more evocative and more creepy is really great.
I'm gonna have to look that one up. I just picked up for the first time Wonderstruck by Brian Selznick.
Yeah, that's a wonderful illustrated book.
Oh yeah, it's captivating.
It is. It truly is. In it, and to me, there's an association in publishing between like illustrations and children's books. Like if you have an illustrated book, it must be for little kids, and I've always tried to push back against that because for years and years, all books for adults were illustrated. You can find the original famous illustrations for Sherlock Holmes, for Pride and Prejudice, etc. And
we froze.
Whoop! I blinked out. Am I back?
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you before. There you are now.
I was just saying, at some point they became associated with children's books, but I've always tried to push back on that. And I've done multiple like illustrated books, and I always feel like it enriches the experience of reading. So
I completely agree. It kind of like, it makes your brain feel a little bit lighter too, when there's something to break up the words. Like it's easier to read sometimes. It just depends, I guess, maybe on the kind of mood that you're in.
That's true.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I had such a great time. The hour really flew by. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your beautiful work.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you guys for all of the amazing questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. But you can always find me online. I have an Instagram at CassieClare1. You can ask me questions there. I do videos and answer questions all the time. So not that hard to get to. And yeah, this has been really enjoyable. I love talking about writing, and I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. I also want to extend a huge thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream where those tabs are, you can find a link to pre-order Cassandra's book that's coming out in October, Swordcatcher. You'll also find a link there that tells you the best order to read her books in, because there were a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, it's on my website, and there's also my publisher's website. There are guides to the right order to read the books. So,
so I didn't want to take up time with those questions, because it's all there for you on her website. We look forward to seeing you all on August 30th when we chat with college admissions expert and New York Times bestselling author Jeff Salingo, and again on September 7th in conversation with celebrity chef, restaurateur, and cookbook author Lydia Bastianich. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.